At 7:42 a.m. on November 11, 2012, a housekeeper stepped into a quiet beachfront villa in Belize and found a man lying face up on the floor, blood already cooling beneath him, a single 9mm bullet buried in the back of his skull, clean, precise execution style. Within hours, local police named their primary suspect, and the name detonated across international headlines, not because he was a criminal, but because he was a legend. John McAfee, the billionaire who helped invent antivirus software, the man whose code once protected nearly half the world's computers from invisible threats. When officers arrived to question him, they found his gates open, his house empty, his life already erased from the map. No struggle, no trail, no explanation. And when that invasion comes, the response is rarely measured. The moment everything changed came not with a gunshot, but with boots on the ground. On April 30th, 2012, Belize's gang suppression unit stormed John McAfee's jungle compound with military precision. Officers in tactical gear poured through the gates, weapons raised, shouting commands, lining McAfee, his girlfriend, and his staff against a wall at gunpoint. No warrant was presented, no clear explanation given. The raid dragged on for hours as police tore through buildings, overturned lab equipment, seized firearms, and scrutinized bottles of chemicals McAfee insisted were experimental antibiotics. Then came the moment that would burn itself into his memory. His dog's massive mastiffs, bred for protection, charged the intruders. An officer fired. One animal collapsed mid-stride, lifeless in the dirt. McAfee screamed in fury as he was forced face down, powerless, watching what he believed was proof that the state had crossed an invisible line. When the raid finally ended, the legal outcome was absurdly small. No drugs, no major charges, only a minor paperwork violation for an unlicensed firearm. McAfee was detained overnight in a fetid holding cell, bribing guards for cigarettes, humiliated and enraged, then released the next morning as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The raid didn't just strip his compound, it shattered his remaining trust in authority. From that day forward, McAfee believed the government wasn't investigating him, it was hunting him. He began sleeping with a handgun under his pillow, installing tripwires and cameras around the property, speaking obsessively about assassination plots and corrupt alliances between police and criminal gangs. Visitors noticed his conversations looping, circling back to betrayal surveillance and imminent death. Belize's prime minister would later describe him as extremely paranoid. McAfee wore the label like armor. In his mind, paranoia was no longer a flaw. It was adaptation. When institutions act without restraint, he reasoned, survival demands anticipation, not compliance. Every unfamiliar sound became a threat. Every dispute became strategic. The line between defense and preemption blurred. What had once been eccentric self-isolation hardened into a siege mentality, and once a man begins to believe the world is closing in, he stops waiting for proof. He prepares for war. The final rupture didn't arrive as chaos. It arrived as inevitability. For weeks, tension had been tightening along the quiet shoreline of Ambergris. Case centered on a simmering feud between John McAfee and his neighbor Gregory Fall, a 52-year-old American expatriate who had come to Belize seeking peace and found instead a war of nerves. Fall complained about McAfee's dogs, 9 large animals roaming freely, barking through the night, occasionally biting tourists. He filed reports. He confronted McAfee directly. Words were exchanged that could not be taken back. Then on the night of November 9, 2012, something snapped. McAfee's dogs began convulsing, foaming at the mouth, collapsing one by one in the dirt. By morning, they were dead poisoned. To McAfee, this was no accident and no warning. It was a declaration. He ordered his staff to shoot the remaining animals to end their suffering, pacing the compound with a pistol in his hand, consumed by rage and certainty. In his mind, the siege he had long predicted had begun. 24 hours later, just after nightfall on November 10th, a single gunshot cracked the air on the island. Neighbors heard it and dismissed it as fireworks, the sound quickly swallowed by darkness and distance. The next morning, a housekeeper entered Gregory Fall's villa. and found him lying face up on the floor, a pool of blood beneath his head, a 9mm bullet lodged in the back of his skull. Execution style. His laptop and phone were gone. Paradise froze. Belizean police moved quickly, their attention turning immediately to Fall's volatile neighbor. But when officers arrived at McAfee's compound around noon, they found the gates open and the house abandoned. McAfee had not waited to be questioned. He had vanished, not in panic but with purpose. In that moment, suspicion hardened into a global alarm. Whatever had happened inside that villa, John McAfee had decided that the system would never hear his side of the story. And once he disappeared, there was no turning back. John McAfee did not flee blindly. He moved with the calm of someone who had rehearsed disappearance long before it became necessary. Within hours of vanishing, he activated a loose but effective network of safe houses scattered across Belize's interior, abandoned warehouses, sympathetic locals' homes, a fishing shack hidden along a mangrove river. Police and soldiers swept the region with helicopters and dogs erecting roadblocks on every major highway, raiding properties tied to his name. But McAfee remained a ghost. He understood something law enforcement often underestimated: speed matters less than unpredictability. While authorities followed procedures, McAfee followed intuition. After 3 days underground with pressure tightening and informants beginning to talk, he executed his exit. Under cover of darkness, he boarded a small fishing boat on Belize's southern coast, paying the captain in cash for an illegal crossing into Guatemala. No passport, no records, just open water and silence. Hours later, he stepped onto a deserted beach near Puerto Barrios and disappeared again into the jungle. By sunrise, he was in Guatemala City, checking into a hotel under a false name, briefly exhaling after 72 hours of pure survival. But McAfee could never resist the spotlight for long. As international media fixated on the murder investigation, he decided controlling the narrative was as important as controlling his location. He contacted journalists offering exclusive access to the world's most wanted tech mogul. Photos were taken, a story was published. And in a single moment of irony bordering on self-sabotage, the image revealed more than words ever could. Embedded GPS metadata exposed his exact location. Within hours, Guatemalan police surrounded the hotel and arrested him on charges of illegal entry. The chase appeared over. It wasn't. Facing imminent deportation back to Belize, McAfee collapsed in his cell, clutching his chest, gasping for air. Guards panicked. Cameras rolled. Doctors rushed him to a hospital where he claimed multiple heart attacks. The spectacle bought him time, just enough. As lawyers flooded the courts with emergency filings and media scrutiny mounted, Guatemala chose the simplest exit from an international nightmare. Instead of sending McAfee back to Belize, they deported him to the United States. With a single legal maneuver, McAfee turned capture into escape once again. He walked off the plane in Miami unshaven but smiling, a free man leaving behind stunned governments and a growing realization that chasing him would never be straightforward. What followed was not a normal manhunt. It was a decade-long psychological war between one man and the modern state, a conflict that exposed how fragile law enforcement becomes when it collides with money, paranoia, media, and absolute defiance. McAfee didn't just run. He vanished, resurfaced, taunted authorities online, manipulated journalists, faked medical emergencies, crossed borders illegally, and repeatedly escaped capture while governments scrambled, embarrassed, and outplayed. 3 countries would issue warrants. Interpol would join the hunt. The United States would deploy international resources to track him down. And time after time, John McAfee slipped through their fingers. This is not simply the story of a murder suspect on the run. Freedom did not calm John McAfee. It amplified him. Back in the United States, no longer a fugitive but not quite a civilian, he reinvented himself with the same instinct that once built his empire by staying unpredictable. He mocked his past-released viral videos, drenched in satire and excess, announced a presidential run no one expected him to win, and later crowned himself a prophet of cryptocurrency, warning that governments were collapsing and only encryption would save the individual. To some, he was a clown. To others, a truth-teller unafraid to say what polite society avoided. But beneath the performance, the pressure never lifted. McAfee had not filed taxes in years, openly daring the IRS to come after him. And eventually, they did. Indicted for tax evasion facing decades in prison, he chose motion over surrender, disappearing once more, this time aboard a yacht drifting between countries, taunting authorities online, turning pursuit into spectacle. For 18 months he survived on cash crypto and constant exposure betting that fame itself could function as armor. But systems are patient. In October 2020, Spanish authorities arrested him at an airport outside Barcelona, ending years of flight with a quiet click of handcuffs. The cage he had spent a lifetime avoiding finally closed. As extradition loomed, McAfee spoke openly about death, warning that if he were found dead, it would not be by choice. When he was discovered hanging in his cell hours after a court approved his transfer to the United States, the official conclusion was swift suicide. The debate, however, never stopped. Supporters insisted he was silenced. Critics argued he chose the only exit he could still control. Perhaps both missed the deeper truth. John McAfee spent his life proving that systems can be bent, delayed, embarrassed, but not erased. He turned paranoia into profit freedom, into ideology, and his own existence into a prolonged act of defiance. In the end, the question isn't whether he beat the system. It's whether a life spent running can ever truly be called free. John McAfee's story isn't just about crime paranoia or a man on the run. It's a mirror held up to modern society. In an age where surveillance is constant and institutions feel distant, his life taps into a deep American tension between individual freedom and collective order. McAfee proved that systems can be delayed, confused, even humiliated, but never fully escaped. The same intelligence that built protection for millions also built a prison of isolation around himself. His story is a warning when distrust becomes absolute freedom can quietly turn into a dead end. Independence without accountability doesn't lead to liberation. It leads to collision. The lesson isn't to blindly trust authority, but to understand that living entirely outside the system comes at a cost most people never calculate until it's too late. If this story made you think, hit like. If you believe others should hear it, share it. And if you want more deep investigations into power control and the people who challenge them, subscribe, because the next story goes even further. It's the story of how a man who built his fortune, selling protection from fear, became consumed by fear himself, how a tech genius turned his life into a weaponized performance, and how the systems designed to control chaos proved disturbingly easy to exploit. How does a 67-year-old millionaire disappear in a country smaller than Massachusetts? How does one person stay free while entire governments close in? And when the walls finally do close, what does a man who has spent his entire life refusing control do next? To understand the ending, we have to start much earlier, before the gunshot, before the jungle, before Belize, back when John McAfee learned that fear, once mastered, is more powerful than any law. Long before John McAfee became a fugitive, before the jungle compounds and international manhunts, he mastered something far more powerful than code fear. In the late 1980s, as personal computers quietly entered American offices and homes, a new, invisible threat emerged: computer viruses spreading through floppy disks, corrupting data, paralyzing businesses. Most people didn't understand what was happening, only that something uncontrollable was creeping inside their machines. McAfee understood immediately that this confusion was the real danger. He wasn't the first programmer to study malware, but he was among the first to realize that technology alone wouldn't win the battle. Perception would. While others wrote defensive code, McAfee publicly predicted collapse. In interviews and trade publications, he warned that viruses could cripple corporations, drain millions overnight, and bring entire systems to their knees. The language was deliberate, calibrated to amplify anxiety without sounding hysterical. And it worked. IT managers didn't buy his software because they trusted it. They bought it because they were afraid of what would happen without it. VirusScan became less a program than a promise order in a digital wilderness that no one yet understood. McAfee Associates exploded from the trunk of his car into a Silicon Valley powerhouse almost overnight, servicing more than half of the Fortune 100 and doubling revenue every 6 months. But with success came something McAfee despised even more than viruses oversight. Board meetings, regulators, shareholders, lawyers, layers of authority demanding compliance, predictability, restraint. To McAfee, it felt like a cage. This was a man who had been expelled from academic programs, fired from engineering jobs, and known for pushing boundaries simply to see where they broke. Corporate discipline suffocated him. He didn't want to run a system. He wanted to outthink it. In 1993, at the height of his power, McAfee cashed out, walking away with roughly $100 million and leaving behind the empire that still bore his name. To the outside world, it looked like liberation. But psychologically, something darker was forming. McAfee had learned a lesson that would define the rest of his life. Systems are built on fear, and fear can be controlled. Once you understand that rules stop feeling permanent, authority stops feeling absolute, and freedom begins to look less like a right and more like something you take. By 2009, John McAfee wasn't running from the law, he was running from the idea that anyone should be able to watch him at all. Belize offered what Silicon Valley never could: anonymity disguised as paradise. No extradition treaty with the United States. Limited financial oversight. Weak institutional reach. To McAfee, it wasn't a hiding place. It was a blank slate. He arrived not as a refugee, but as a man intent on rebuilding reality on his own terms. He bought a sprawling beachfront home on Ambergris Cay, then a second compound deep in the jungle near Orange Walk, far from tourists, far from scrutiny. What began as eccentricity quickly evolved into control. McAfee surrounded himself with armed security, many of them former convicts men, loyal not to the law but to money and proximity to power. He constructed a makeshift laboratory where he claimed to be researching herbal antibiotics, capable of defeating drug-resistant bacteria, presenting himself as a renegade scientist working outside the corruption of big pharma. To outsiders, it sounded idealistic. To those closer, it felt theatrical. The lab was less about medicine than insulation, a justification for isolation, secrecy, and armed protection. As months passed, McAfee's behavior grew more erratic. He hosted bonfire parties where automatic weapons were displayed openly, not as tools, but as symbols. He flew ultralight aircraft over the reef by day, patrolling his territory like a private airspace. At night, music echoed across the shoreline, while locals whispered warnings to one another. Complaints mounted about noise, about intimidation, about dogs roaming freely and biting tourists. Belizean authorities began receiving reports not of crimes, but of instability. McAfee wasn't breaking laws so much as bending the atmosphere around him, creating a zone where rules felt optional and consequences uncertain. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger it became. There was no clear criminal enterprise, no drug operation, no financial fraud. They could pin down only a growing sense that McAfee was operating outside the social contract itself. He didn't trust institutions, didn't respect boundaries, and increasingly spoke of governments as parasites designed to harvest obedience. To some, he was a brilliant exile chasing purity and freedom. To others, he was a volatile presence whose paranoia was turning inward, fermenting into something dangerous. Belize, for all its beauty, was not built to contain men who believed laws were illusions. And quietly beneath the surface of palm trees and turquoise, water pressure was building. Because when a man constructs his own world, any intrusion feels like an invasion.